When we think about revolutions, we conjure images of passionate crowds, inspired leaders, and grassroots movements born from the people's desire for change. But here's what historians don't always tell you. Behind many of history's most significant political upheavals lies an unglamorous truth. Money moved hands, loans were arranged. Central banks, institutions designed to be stuffy, technical, and apolitical, played quiet but pivotal roles in reshaping entire nations. This isn't a conspiracy theory whispered in dark corners. It's documented financial history, and the evidence is sitting in archives and academic papers across the world. The story of central banks and revolutions reveals something uncomfortable about how power really works. These institutions, which we think of today as boring monetary authorities obsessed with interest rates and inflation, were actually born as instruments of statecraft. They financed wars, engineered the rise and fall of regimes, and quietly directed the course of human history through the seemingly neutral mechanism of credit. Welcome to the hidden world where finance met revolution. To understand how central banks became entangled with political upheaval, we need to rewind to their beginnings. The modern central bank didn't emerge from economic theory or careful planning by academics. It came from necessity, specifically the desperate need to finance wars. The Bank of England, established in 1694, is the perfect example. It wasn't created to manage inflation or maintain price stability. It was created because King William III needed money to fight Louis XIV of France. The English government faced a problem. It was broke, and nobody wanted to lend to it. So, the Crown struck a bargain with private financiers. They would create a bank that could issue currency and lend to the government. In exchange, the bank and its investors would get extraordinary privileges and profits. It was transactional, it was cynical, and it worked spectacularly well. This model spread across Europe like a contagion. The Banque de France, established by Napoleon in 1800, followed the same playbook. It was designed to stabilize currency after hyperinflation, yes, but also to serve as a financial engine for Napoleon's wars and imperial ambitions. Central banks were never neutral. They were instruments of state power wrapped in the language of economic necessity. The crucial insight here is this. When you create an institution with the power to create money, control credit, and manage the flow of capital through an entire economy, you've created something that can reshape political reality. Governments understood this, and so did financiers. The question was always, who would control this immense power? Let's travel to colonial America in the 1760s, because this is where the story becomes truly wild. The American colonies were prosperous. Benjamin Franklin knew why. When I interviewed historians researching the financial origins of American independence, one fact kept surfacing. The colonies had figured out something that terrified London. The colonies issued their own currency, colonial script. It was backed not by gold or silver, but by confidence in the colonial government's ability to manage it responsibly. And it worked. The economy hummed along. The money supply matched the demands of trade and industry. Prices were stable. People prospered. This prosperity had a name: freedom from central banking. Then the Bank of England noticed, and the Rothschild family, who had substantial influence over the bank, perceived an opportunity. When London learned how the colonies had achieved their prosperity through local currency control, a decision was made. In 1764, through the Currency Act, the British Parliament, influenced by Bank of England directors, prohibited the colonial governments from issuing their own money. The colonists were ordered to conduct all future transactions in gold and silver coins. The effect was immediate and devastating. Currency dried up. The money supply contracted sharply. What had been a thriving economy spiraled into depression. unemployment skyrocketed. People who had been comfortable suddenly found themselves struggling. The streets of the colonies were filled with the unemployed. One contemporary observer noted that conditions reversed so dramatically that what had been an era of prosperity ended, replaced by depression, to such an extent that the streets of the colonies were filled with unemployed. Here's where it gets interesting from a revolutionary standpoint. This financial squeeze wasn't accidental, it was engineered. The monetary crisis created by the Currency Act became one of the foundational grievances that sparked the American Revolution. Now, the Declaration of Independence focuses on taxation without representation and abstract principles of rights. But talk to financial historians, and they'll tell you something different. The revolution had monetary roots. Fast forward through the war itself. The Bank of England actually profited handsomely from the conflict. George Washington himself remained a shareholder of the Bank of England throughout the American War of Independence. Business was so good for the bank during the fighting that it continued operations smoothly, all while Britain fought desperately to suppress the rebellion. This wasn't ideology clashing with ideology. This was money making money regardless of which side won. When it came time to finance the Revolutionary War itself, the Continental Congress printed money at a frantic pace. This continental dollar depreciated rapidly because it lacked proper backing. But who really financed American independence? Not the British, obviously. The answer is France. French loans kept the American army in the field. French gold paid the soldiers when continental dollars became worthless. And France paid this price, partly because it saw an opportunity to weaken Britain, but partly because financiers recognized that an independent America would eventually become a profitable client. The true financing genius of the war was Robert Morris, a Philadelphia businessman who essentially pledged his personal credit to back government loans. When Congress ran out of money, and it frequently did, Morris guaranteed debts with his own reputation and wealth. He smuggled gunpowder past British blockades. He supplied ships from his own fleet. He issued promissory notes backed by his personal fortune. In a very real sense, Robert Morris acted like a private central bank, providing the liquidity and credit that a fledgling government couldn't. This is the first crucial insight. The American Revolution wasn't directly funded by a central bank, but it was shaped by central banking dynamics. The monetary crisis, triggered by the Currency Act, provided grievance. The collapse of alternative currencies drove colonists toward independence. And private financiers, acting in a quasi-central banking capacity, provided the liquidity that made victory possible. By the 19th century, a pattern had emerged. Central banks and political upheaval became intertwined in ways that were no longer accidental. They became deliberate policy tools. The strategy was elegant and remarkably consistent across different countries and continents. It worked like this. When the British Empire or other European powers wanted to influence or control a foreign territory, they wouldn't necessarily send in armies first. They would establish financial dominance. They would loan money to governments. They would create infrastructure projects, railways, ports, and communication networks. But these loans came with strings attached. The requirements became standardized. If a government borrowed from foreign banks, particularly banks backed by European central banks, that government had to grant the foreign financiers control over monetary policy. The country had to adopt the gold standard, which severely limited the money supply and made the country dependent on foreign capital. Local elites who wanted to rebel would find their access to credit suddenly disappear. This mechanism became so effective that it was essentially colonialism by another name. Nations that had formally achieved independence found themselves locked in financial relationships that gave foreign powers extraordinary influence over their domestic policy. Latin American countries discovered this in the 19th and early 20th centuries when they found their central banks essentially controlled by foreign financiers and international organizations. Latin American independence in the early 1800s created a vacuum. Newly independent nations needed money to build infrastructure, establish governments, and create economies. Where could they get it? From Britain, France, and other European powers, and these powers would loan the money, but always with conditions. The irony is profound. Latin American countries fought for political independence from Spain and Portugal, only to find themselves financially dependent on Britain and other European nations. The debt accumulated. The interest payments became crushing. The region's economies began to orient themselves around serving foreign investors rather than developing their own productive capacity. By the 1920s, the situation had become so dire that a new solution emerged. The United States, now ascendant as a global power, began promoting a specific model. Latin American countries would establish independent central banks. American financial expert Edwin Kemmerer led missions to various countries. Peru established a central bank in 1922. Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia followed in the mid to late 1920s. Mexico created one in 1925. These central banks were supposed to be independent from political interference. That's what the paperwork said. What actually happened was more complicated. These central banks were designed with one paramount goal: to ensure that the government paid back its foreign debts. To accomplish this, they were forbidden from financing government spending, forced onto the gold standard, and structured in ways that gave foreign creditors extraordinary power over monetary policy. This wasn't accidental either. The conditions imposed by international lenders during this period established a principle that would echo through the 20th century. Political independence can be constrained through monetary independence. If a government couldn't control its own central bank, then it couldn't control its own money supply. And if it couldn't control its money supply, it couldn't fund policy priorities that threatened foreign interests. The devastating inflation that plagued many Latin American countries in the 1970s and 1980s came partly from governments overriding these constraints, trying to regain control of their monetary systems to fund policies their populations demanded. But the system was designed to make this extraordinarily difficult. Central banks in the region were deliberately structured to resist political pressure because the real goal was protecting creditor interests, not managing inflation or achieving development. There's a name for this strategy: dollar diplomacy. During the early 20th century, the United States government, working alongside American financial institutions, explicitly demanded that Latin American countries establish independent central banks as a condition of receiving loans. This wasn't about sound monetary policy, it was about control. The principle was straightforward. If you need money, you have to surrender control over your monetary policy to foreign creditors, the U.S. Government understood that controlling a nation's money was more effective than controlling its government. You could have the most patriotic nationalist leader imaginable, but if they couldn't print money or control credit, they couldn't actually implement the policies their citizens demanded. Germany, after World War I, experienced this dynamic. When the League of Nations lent money to the Weimar Republic, it required that Germany establish an independent central bank, the Reichsbank, insulated from political control. The goal was to ensure Germany met its reparation payments to the victors. The League understood something crucial. Monetary independence wasn't about economic efficiency. It was about ensuring that a defeated nation couldn't mobilize its economy in ways that might threaten the post-war order. What's particularly brilliant about this system is that it appears apolitical. When you read the documents, They're full of technical language about reserve requirements, inflation targeting, and sound monetary principles. Nobody has to explicitly say, "We're using central bank independence to prevent democratic governments from implementing policies we dislike." The structure does the work. The mechanism enforces the outcome. The pattern continues into the modern era, just with more sophisticated institutions and language. When the International Monetary Fund arrives in a country facing a financial crisis, it brings a rescue package. Borrowing countries typically receive access to the capital they desperately need. In exchange, they have to accept conditions. And what's at the top of virtually every IMF conditions list? Central bank independence. This isn't coincidental. The IMF and World Bank have learned from decades of experience that they can reshape a country's political economy more effectively through monetary institutions than through direct political pressure. By requiring central bank independence, they're not just asking for sound economic management. They're structurally preventing democratic governments from using monetary policy to address inequality, fund social services, or pursue development goals that don't align with creditor interests. The evidence is stark. Countries that accepted IMF programs in the 1980s and 1990s saw their central banks gain legal independence. What followed wasn't stability, it was often stagnation. The money supply contracted. Interest rates rose. Investment dried up. Unemployment increased. But the debts got paid. The foreign creditors got their money back. And the country's ability to pursue an independent economic policy was permanently compromised. Brazil illustrates this dynamic in real time. When the Brazilian central bank gained formal independence in 2021, it was hailed as a victory for sound monetary management. But watch what happened next. When elected government officials wanted to pursue policies that would boost employment and growth, they faced a central bank that was legally insulated from political pressure and explicitly focused on fighting inflation. The same inflation that had ravaged so many Latin American countries in the past. The same monetary squeeze that had devastated colonial America 2 centuries earlier. This brings us to the real insight about central banks and revolutions. We think of revolutions as moments of dramatic rupture, sudden changes when one group takes power from another. But there's another kind of revolution, the gradual transformation of what's possible through financial mechanisms. When a central bank gains independence from democratic control, something fundamental shifts. The government's ability to implement the will of its people becomes constrained by an institution insulated from democratic pressure. This isn't a revolution in the traditional sense. Nobody's storming barricades. But the structure of power is being rewritten. There's a reason that authoritarian leaders and oligarchs consistently push for central bank independence. They understand that once you insulate monetary policy from democratic control, you've created an obstacle that any future government, no matter how popular, will struggle to overcome. You've essentially embedded creditor interests into the structure of the state itself. Some countries have experimented with what might be called counter-revolution, trying to reclaim democratic control over monetary policy. Venezuela and Argentina have repeatedly attempted this, often with dramatic results. Turkey, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has systematically undermined the independence of its central bank, reasserting political control. What we see is not stability, but volatility, high inflation, and economic chaos. This proves the creditor interests point perfectly. You cannot ignore the demands of those who control capital. You cannot pursue policies that frighten foreign investors. The monetary system enforces discipline. But here's the thing that central bankers and IMF officials won't admit. This system isn't inevitable. It's chosen. It could be different. Some countries have maintained central banks that are both stable and more responsive to democratic inputs. The question is whether societies will demand it. When we step back and look at the entire historical arc, a pattern emerges that's almost too consistent to ignore. First comes financial crisis or political instability. A country lacks money or credit. Its government is weak. This is when central banks and international creditors arrive with an offer. They'll provide the capital the country desperately needs, but in exchange, monetary policy must be controlled by an independent institution insulated from democratic pressure. Second, the country agrees because it has no choice. The alternative is economic collapse, hyperinflation, or political chaos. So, the central bank becomes independent. Formal control shifts from elected politicians to technocrats. The money supply becomes tightly constrained. Third comes the long-term effect. The country's government can no longer use monetary policy to meet its population's demands. It cannot run fiscal deficits to fund infrastructure or social programs without central bank permission. It cannot devalue the currency to help exporters. It cannot expand the money supply to accommodate economic growth. All the tools that allow democratic governments to respond to their people's needs are removed. This final stage isn't a revolution in any traditional sense. There's no political upheaval, but the balance of power has shifted fundamentally. Foreign creditors, not democratic processes, now determine monetary policy. And monetary policy determines everything: how much unemployment exists, whether growth happens, whether public services can be funded, and whether inequality grows or shrinks. So here we are in the 21st century. We have central banks across the globe designed to be independent from democratic control. They're presented as apolitical, technical institutions focused on fighting inflation and maintaining financial stability. But history suggests something different. History shows that central banking has always been political. It's always been about power. The independence we celebrate might just be independence from democratic accountability, not independence from power. It might simply be power exercised through different mechanisms. The stunning thing is how quiet this has all become. We don't debate monetary policy in elections the way we debate taxation or spending. We don't ask candidates what their vision for central bank reform might be. We've accepted the premise that monetary policy belongs to technocrats, not democracies. Meanwhile, the fundamental reality hasn't changed since the Bank of England was established in 1694. Control over money is control over society. Control over the money supply is control over what's politically possible, and control over the central bank is control over the money supply. The revolutions don't happen because the people never mobilize to retake monetary policy. The system is designed so they don't notice what's happened until it's far too late. That's the real secret that central banks have learned. The most effective revolution is the one nobody realizes is happening.